Jackie Chan drove through a silent Hong Kong, cutting through the streets illuminated by neon signs. The engine of his sports bike roared quietly, a familiar sound that brought him a strange sense of comfort. He liked these rare nights of tranquility, away from the flashes and crowds that always surrounded him. But something made him slow down abruptly. In the corner of an alleyway, a solitary figure was sitting on the sidewalk, wrapped in a worn blanket. To anyone else, that scene could have been just another portrait of the city's inequality. But when Jackie Chan took a closer look, he felt a chill run down his spine. He knew that person. What happened next was not just a gesture of kindness, but an encounter that would bring to light a painful past, a past he was never able to completely erase. Before we continue this story, please comment on where you're watching this video from. And if you like stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we'll have another special story for you. Now let's go back to that unforgettable night. The roar of the engine of his Ducati Panigale V4 reverberated through the deserted alleys of Hong Kong. The city, always vibrant, now seemed to be taking a brief nap. The lights reflected off the damp asphalt, while a soft mist rose from the harbor. Jackie Chan sped along leisurely, his thoughts traveling far and wide. His fingers, covered in leather gloves, gripped the handlebars tightly. The cold wind cut across his face, but he didn't care. These night rides were his refuge. After long days full of commitments, training, and charity events, these escapades on his bike were what kept him centered. The roar of the engine, the smell of the road, the feeling of freedom. It was a moment all of its own. That night in particular had a greater weight. And then something caught his eye. Jackie Chan had just taken part in a charity event to raise funds for a martial arts program aimed at low-income young people. The cause touched his heart deeply, as he himself had had a difficult childhood. As he shook hands and posed for photos, his mind went back to the past, to the days of strict training at the Peking Opera School, where he learned everything he knows. Across the street, near an abandoned commercial building, a motionless figure was cowering against the wall. A woman. The scene could have been one of many in the city, but something inside him prevented him from simply moving on. His chest tightened. What was it that made him hesitate? Perhaps the way she held that dirty blanket, as if it were her only possession. Perhaps the way her frail body seemed to shrink in size. Maybe it was just instinct. Or something else. Jackie frowned and looked straight ahead, trying to ignore that strange sensation. But her heart pounded harder. Restlessness settled inside him. He couldn't just walk away. He took a deep breath and with one agile movement turned the bike around. He slowed down and approached. The headlight illuminated the woman, revealing her fragile outline in the darkness. Jackie stopped the bike, switched off the engine, and slowly took off his gloves. His fingers were shaking. He knew the answer before he even asked. He took a step forward. The sound of his boots against the wet ground echoed down the silent street. The woman moved slightly, perhaps sensing his presence. Jackie held her breath. As she got closer, the details became clearer. The worn coat, the grey strands of hair escaping from the hood, her wrinkled hands clutching that dirty blanket tightly as if it were the only thing she had left. Then her stomach churned. Even in the dim light of the street lamps, even with the shadows hiding the marks of time and suffering, he recognized that face. Time had stopped. Jackie moistened his lips, his throat closed up. When he finally managed to speak, his voice came out low, almost a whisper. "Ms. Wong." The woman shuddered when she heard her name. Slowly, as if each movement required an immense effort, she raised her face. Her eyes, tired and dull, met his. Jackie Chan was breathless. For a brief moment, nothing else existed. The empty streets, the cold wind, the silence of the city. Everything disappeared. All that was left was that moment. Her lips parted, and then her body collapsed. Before she hit the ground, Jackie lunged forward and caught her in his arms. A shiver ran down her spine. She was too light, too fragile. 1,000 questions flooded his mind, but this was not the time for answers. Because before he could say anything, her eyes closed. And in that instant, Jackie knew that nothing else that night would ever be the same. His name escaped her lips like a whisper of disbelief, as if trying to confirm whether he was real or just a shadow of a distant memory. Jackie Chan nodded, trying to offer a reassuring smile, but his chest felt tight. "It's me, Ms. Wong. It's really me." The silence that followed was overwhelming. He could see her eyes moving, as if her mind was trying to put the pieces together and understand why. After so many years, Jackie was standing there in front of her. Gradually, the initial shock gave way to something deeper, recognition. For a brief moment, Jackie was no longer there on the cold streets of Hong Kong. He was a boy again. There he was, standing on the old stage of the Peking Opera School, holding the script with sweaty hands, too nervous to speak. And then he heard her voice echoing in his memory. "On stage you never hide, you feel, you live." Then in the blink of an eye, Jackie was yanked back to the present, back to reality, in front of the woman who had once taught him everything about acting, dedication, and passion for art. But now, she was unrecognizable. Jackie's chest tightened. How had this happened? He swallowed dryly and finally broke the silence. "Is it really you?" She inhaled the air with difficulty. Her voice came out rough. "I think so." Her words were weak, laden with the weight of decades. Jackie hesitated. There were so many questions he wanted to ask, but something inside him warned him to be careful. He began, but stopped. "What could I say?" Ms. Wong tried to move, but her body wouldn't respond. A slight tremor ran through her fragile skin, and Jackie realized how weak she was. Without thinking twice, he took off his leather jacket and draped it over her shoulders. She gasped at the unexpected warmth, but didn't refuse. Then, in an almost inaudible whisper, she murmured, "It's been a long time, hasn't it?" Jackie Chan nodded, watching her carefully. Yes, it had been a long time, but no amount of years could have prepared him for this reunion. She ran her hand over her face, as if trying to wake up from a nightmare that had lasted years. Her eyes dropped to the floor, avoiding his. Jackie noticed her discomfort, the fear, the shame. She didn't want to be seen like that. But he saw her, and before she could stop herself, the words escaped her mouth. "What happened to you?" The silence that followed was sharp as a blade. Ms. Wong lowered her head. Her thin, wrinkled hands clutched the dirty blanket around her tighter. Jackie felt the weight of that moment. Her story was there, trapped in the words she still couldn't say. He waited, and after a long pause, she finally whispered something that sent a shiver down her spine. "I tried, Jackie." Her eyes filled with tears, but none fell. "I tried." What did she mean by that? What had she tried? Before Jackie could ask, her body gave way again. This time he was ready. He held her tight. Now he was sure he couldn't leave her there. He had to do something. With her heart racing and her mind spinning, Jackie made a decision. But she knew that the night was far from over. The silence between them was heavy. Jackie was still holding Miss Wong, trying to prevent her from fainting again. The weight of her body seemed unreal. She was not a shadow of the strong, determined woman he had known years ago. Carefully, he helped her lean against the cold wall of the building. Her breathing was irregular, interspersed with small tremors. Jackie couldn't tell if it was the cold or extreme tiredness. She hesitated before speaking. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes blinked slowly, as if staying awake was a superhuman effort. After a few seconds, her eyes met his. "Yes," Jackie sighed quietly. The truth was that he had no idea what to do. The need to help her was overwhelming. But at the same time, he knew he couldn't just pick her up in his arms and carry her away. He needed to understand. "What happened to you?" This time she didn't answer. She just looked away. Silence hung in the air. Jackie sat down next to her, oblivious to the cold, dirty floor. At that moment, he knew he wasn't going anywhere. Ms. Wong pulled the blanket tighter around her body, as if it were the only thing keeping her in one piece. Her breathing steadied a little, but her gaze remained distant. After a long time, she finally spoke. Her voice was weak, hoarse. "You shouldn't be here." Jackie looked at her calmly. "And where should I be?" She laughed softly, humorlessly. "You've always been stubborn, Chun." He didn't smile. There was something in her eyes, something beyond pain. He recognized it. It was shame. She didn't want him to see her like that. But he had already seen it. The street remained silent until, finally, she began to speak. "Dear, I lost my job when the theater school's funding was cut." But when she heard her say it out loud, reality hit harder. Jackie had already suspected this. "I tried to carry on." She swallowed, her voice breaking. "For a while I gave private lessons, did little jobs here and there. But the bills started piling up. The city swallowed me up." She stopped, her gaze lost in memories too heavy to recall all at once. "At first, I thought it was just a bad phase, that I would soon find another opportunity, that everything would go back to normal." She smiled, but there was no joy in that smile. "But the months went by, and suddenly I didn't have a home anymore." Jackie felt a lump in his throat. He had always known that life could be cruel, but he never imagined it would come to this. She paused. Her gaze was lost in memories that seemed too heavy to relive all at once. "At first I thought it was just a bad phase, that I'd soon find another opportunity, that everything would go back to normal." She sighed deeply, as if the simple act of putting those words out there was exhausting. "But the months passed, and suddenly I no longer had a home." Jackie's stomach tightened. He had always known that life could be cruel, but he had never imagined that it would come to this. "For a while I bounced from sofa to sofa. I stayed with friends who still cared about me." She looked away. But over time the doors began to close. Jackie didn't need to hear any more to understand. He knew how merciless the world could be. People get tired. No one wants to carry a problem that seems to have no solution. Ms. Wong rubbed her hands together as if trying to ward off the cold that seemed to have settled in her bones a long time ago. "And then, the next thing I knew, it was too late." Jackie's chest tightened. He thought of everything that woman had meant to him, the times she had encouraged him, helping him to find his voice and his talent. And now there she was, alone, destroyed. Jackie wanted to say something, anything to ease some of the pain he saw in her eyes. But before she could find the words, she muttered something almost to herself. Her voice shook. "The hardest thing isn't losing things. The hardest thing is losing people." She pressed her lips together, holding something bigger inside her. When she spoke again, her voice was almost a whisper. "I drove everyone away, Jackie." She blinked rapidly, as if trying to hold back tears. "The few who still cared, because deep down, I didn't want to be a burden." A shiver ran down Jackie's spine. He knew that feeling, the feeling of dragging others down, the idea that it would be better to disappear than to be a burden to someone. He knew that darkness, but seeing it reflected in her, it hit him in a way he wasn't ready to feel. Then she said something that made his heart soar. "And I made a mistake I can't undo." She didn't explain, but Jackie noticed the hesitation in her voice. There was something else. Something she wasn't ready to say yet. The silence stretched between them. Jackie ran her hands through her hair, trying to organize her thoughts. He wanted to ask, but he knew he couldn't force her. So instead he spoke firmly. "You're not a burden to me." Ms. Wong closed her eyes. She turned her face away, as if she couldn't face him. "You're just saying that now?" Jackie shook her head. "I'm saying it because it's true." She let out a long sigh, as if she wanted to believe him, but couldn't. And then Jackie asked the question she didn't want to ask, but she knew she had to. "What about your children?" The air seemed to change between them. Ms. Wong's body tensed. For a moment, Jackie thought she wouldn't answer. But then, in an almost imperceptible voice, she murmured, "They tried to help me, and for a while." The incomplete answer made his stomach turn. What had happened to her children? Why was she there alone? Before he could ask, her gaze turned to the empty street. She seemed distant, as if she had forgotten the present. And for the first time that night, Jackie saw something in her eyes that made him deeply uneasy. An absolute emptiness, a pain that went far beyond physical suffering. In that instant, Jackie knew for sure that her story was even worse than he had imagined, and that he hadn't heard everything yet. "They tried to help me, for a while." Her sentence seemed to hang in the air like a suspended blade about to fall. Jackie felt the weight of those words. There was something in them that he still didn't understand. The silence stretched on. Jackie wanted to ask more. She kept staring at the deserted street as if her mind was miles away. He wanted to understand, but something in her expression stopped him. He noticed her hands clenching the dirty blanket, holding it as if it were the only thing still keeping her in the present. So he waited. The wind blew down the street, bringing with it the distant sound of a car passing on another block. Finally she sighed. They did what they could. Her voice was weak, almost lifeless. They helped me when everything started to fall apart. Her fingers moved slowly, as if following the flow of her own thoughts. But after a while, I pushed them away. Jackie frowned. Why? She let out a short, mirthless laugh. Because I didn't want to be a burden. Jackie closed her eyes for a moment. That feeling, he knew it too well, but it still didn't make sense. And they just accepted it? Ms. Wong hesitated before answering. Not immediately. She took a deep breath. They tried. They gave me options, but I refused. She bit her lower lip, as if she were holding something even bigger. After a while, they stopped insisting. Jackie felt her chest tighten. She tried to imagine what had happened. She visualized her children, reaching out to help her, but watching her walk away, lost. And then came the silence. He knew that sometimes people don't leave because they're cruel, but because they're exhausted. That didn't make the situation any less painful. Do they still know where you are? She shrugged. I doubt it. Jackie raised his eyebrows in surprise. You don't talk to them anymore? Ms. Wong shook her head. There's nothing more to say. Her tone was dry, definitive. But Jackie didn't believe her. There was still a lot left unsaid. Silence reigned between them. But now Jackie knew one thing. Her pain was much deeper than he could ever have imagined. Jackie imagined the faces of her children, whom he had never seen, reaching out to help her, but seeing her retreat. And then the silence. He knew that sometimes people don't leave for lack of love, but out of exhaustion. That, however, didn't make it any easier to accept that someone like Miss Wong had been left behind. She shrugged. Do they still know where you are? He asked. You don't talk to them anymore? Jackie frowned. I doubt it. Ms. Wong shook her head slowly. There's nothing more to say. Her cold, definitive tone didn't convince him. He felt that there were still things left unsaid. Silence fell between them, and it was at that moment that Jackie realized. When the cuff of her battered jacket slipped a little, something caught his eye. A scar, thin, pale, cutting into his skin along his forearm. His stomach churned. She noticed his stare, but he didn't try to hide it. She just stared at the mark. And in his gaze there was a clear warning. Don't ask. Jackie pressed her lips together. He wanted to ask. He wanted to understand. But deep down he already knew the answer. And he wasn't sure she was ready to talk about it. So instead he just said, I'm here now. Miss Wong let out a short, humorless laugh. And what does that change? Jackie held her gaze. It means you're no longer alone. She blinked, as if those words were difficult to accept. But before she could answer, the early morning silence was broken. Footsteps. Someone was walking along the promenade not far from them. Jackie turned her head instinctively. Ms. Wong did the same. In the dim light of the street lamps, a silhouette appeared. A man in worn and dirty clothes, his tired gaze fixed on them. He stopped a few meters away. Hey! His voice was rough, hoarse. Do you have a cigarette? Ms. Wong nodded. I don't smoke. The man then looked at Jackie. Jackie kept her gaze steady, her posture relaxed but attentive. The stranger shrugged and continued walking. Ms. Wong let out a slow sigh. Never trust anyone here. She looked straight into Jackie's eyes. You need to leave. Jackie raised an eyebrow. And leave you here alone? She gave a low laugh. I'm not as fragile as I look. Jackie looked away briefly. Maybe not. He looked at her again. But you're not invincible either. She didn't reply. The wind blew once more, kicking up dust from the ground. Jackie knew that the evening wasn't over yet, and that Ms. Wong still had a lot to say. The sky was beginning to lighten, but Hong Kong was still cold and indifferent. Jackie had no idea how much time he had spent there with her. Minutes? Hours? But something inside him told him he couldn't just leave. She, on the other hand, seemed determined to convince him otherwise. You have to go. This time her tone was calm but firm. Jackie crossed her arms and leaned against the wall next to her. "I'm not going anywhere." She let out a tired sigh. "Jackie, don't even try to convince me." Her eyes shone with a mixture of irritation and something else, something he couldn't decipher. "Have you always been this stubborn?" Jackie smiled slightly. "I learned from a teacher." She ducked her head and gave a short, emotionless laugh. Silence took over again. Ms. Wong pulled the old blanket over her body, shrinking down a little more. Jackie could see how tired she was. The cold of the streets was sapping her strength. But he also saw something deeper. She didn't want help. Or rather, she didn't believe she deserved it. And that bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Jackie looked around. The streets were deserted, but he knew that the city never really slept. He turned to her and spoke more seriously this time. "You can't stay here all night." She stared at him. "And what do you suggest?" Jackie hesitated for a moment. "Let's go somewhere else." She frowned as if the idea was absurd. "And where exactly?" He thought quickly. A hotel she'd refuse. His house she'd never accept. Then an idea came to him. A 24-hour snack bar. She blinked, confused. "What?" Jackie shrugged. "Nothing much, just a warm place, coffee, food. You can rest for a while." She opened her mouth to refuse, but Jackie spoke first. "Just an hour. After that you decide what you want to do." Ms. Wong pressed her lips together. Jackie could see her internal conflict. Accepting meant admitting that she needed help. Refusing meant spending the night on that icy sidewalk. In the end, she sighed longingly. Jackie smiled slightly. 1 hour. Deal. The doorbell rang as they entered the diner. The place was simple, with a few customers scattered around the worn tables. Jackie guided Ms. Wong to a more secluded corner. She walked slowly, as if each step required a great effort. As soon as they were seated, a waiter approached. "What can I get for you?" Jackie looked at Ms. Wong, waiting for her to order, but she hesitated. He understood instantly. She wasn't used to choosing, so he did it for her. 2 coffees, and the hottest, strongest dish you have on the menu. The waiter nodded and left. Ms. Wong watched him for a moment. "Have you always had this instinct for saving people?" Jackie shrugged. "I just do what I think is right." She let out a tired sigh, running her hand through her disheveled hair, which was now a little cleaner. "Sometimes people don't want to be saved." Jackie stared at her for a moment. "Sometimes they just think they can't be." Silence settled in again. When the coffee arrived, Ms. Wong held the cup with both hands, as if absorbing the warmth of the liquid. She closed her eyes as she took the first sip. Jackie watched her. At that moment, she seemed so small. So much had been taken away from her. But at the same time, he saw something different. A tiny glimmer shone in her eyes, faint but present. And then she broke the silence. "You want to ask about the scar, don't you?" The question took Jackie by surprise. He stared at her for a moment. He thought about lying, saying no, but he'd never been good at lying. "I want to." Ms. Wong lowered her gaze to the table. It took her a few seconds before she spoke. She took a deep breath. "I was at my worst, Jackie." "Worse than now." Jackie held her breath. She ran her fingers slowly along the rim of the cup. She couldn't see a way out. Her voice wavered. A shiver ran down Jackie's spine. "I didn't think it was worth going on." She didn't need to say any more. He understood. Ms. Wong drew in her breath slowly, as if trying to absorb the reality around her. But somehow, I'm still here." Jackie looked at her for a long time before simply saying, "And I'm happy about that." She looked up surprised, and for a brief moment, Jackie saw something different in her expression. Something he hadn't seen before. Hope. Ms. Wong looked away, staring into her coffee as if searching for answers. Then she muttered, "Why are you doing this, Jackie?" He didn't answer immediately. He just held her gaze and said, "Because one day you did it for me." The silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't a void. It was a pause full of possibilities. The first barrier had been broken. Ms. Wong held the cup but didn't drink. But the road would still be long. She just held it tightly between her hands, as if the warmth could keep it there. Jackie remained silent, just watching. He knew that night was a turning point. Not just for her, but also for him. She had finally talked about the pain, about the scar, about the weight of the choices that had led her there. But now came the hard part, accepting real help. Ms. Wong let out a long sigh and left her cup on the table. "What now, Jackie?" He straightened his posture. "Now, let me help you." She laughed softly, exhausted. "And how exactly do you intend to do that?" Jackie held her gaze firmly. "By taking you to a place where you can start again." She shook her head. "Why?" "It's not that simple." She opened her mouth to answer, but hesitated. For the first time, she seemed uncertain about her own refusal, Jackie noticed. And she knew she was close to breaking down the invisible barrier she had erected around herself. She took a deep breath before continuing. "I met you by chance this evening." She looked at him seriously. "But now that it's happened, I'm not just going to disappear." Ms. Wong looked away. "I don't want to be your responsibility, Jackie." He shook his head. "It's not about responsibility." Jackie leaned forward slightly. "It's about choice." She frowned, confused. "Choice? You've chosen to help many students in the past." Jackie held her gaze. "You chose to believe in me when I doubted myself. Now, it's my turn to believe in you." Her throat tightened. No one had spoken to her like that for a long time. "What if I fail?" Her voice came out as a whisper. Jackie smiled slightly. "What if you don't fail?" Ms. Wong was speechless. This was the question she had never allowed herself to ask. She had spent years believing that she was lost. But now, for the first time in a long time, someone was asking, "What if I'm not?" Slowly, as if testing the words, she murmured, "What do you mean?" Jackie smiled. "There is a support center for homeless women." He kept his tone calm but firm. "They offer recovery programs, therapy, housing assistance, and job opportunities." She frowned. "And you think I belong there?" Jackie arched an eyebrow. "I think you deserve a second chance." Ms. Wong was silent for a long time. The internal battle was on her face. But then, slowly, she nodded. It was an almost imperceptible movement, but Jackie saw it. "All right," she whispered. "Let's give it a try." The city was still asleep as Jackie drove through the empty streets. This time, he wasn't on his motorcycle. He took a car to make her more comfortable. Ms. Wong remained silent, watching the city lights through the window, lost in thought. By the time they reached the center, the sun was beginning to rise. The building was simple, discreet, but welcoming. Women walked from one side to the other. Some carried backpacks, others chatted softly. Jackie turned off the engine and looked at her. "Are you ready?" She let out a long sigh. "I don't know." Jackie smiled slightly. "It's all right." He opened the door. "We'll go in your time." Miss Wong stared at the entrance to the center, then at him. Finally, she opened the door and went downstairs. She walked slowly to the door. Her fingers hovered over the handle. Jackie stood beside her. Step by step, she closed her eyes for a moment. Then she pushed the door open and stepped inside. Jackie smiled. The transformation had begun. Women walked back and forth, some carrying backpacks, others chatting quietly. "Are you ready?" Jackie switched off the engine and looked at her. Ms. Wong let out a long sigh. Jackie smiled. "I don't know." "It's all right, we'll go in your time." Miss Wong looked at the entrance to the center, then at Jackie. Finally, she opened the car door and got out. She walked slowly to the door. Her fingers hovered hesitantly over the handle. Jackie stood beside her. "Step by step," he said. She closed her eyes for a moment. Then he pushed the door open and stepped inside. Jackie smiled. The transformation had begun. The afternoon was filled with laughter and excited voices. Children ran around the stage, rehearsing lines for a play that was to take place at the end of the month. Jackie walked among the young actors, helping a boy to project his voice better. But suddenly he stopped. At the other end of the room, near the side door, he saw her, Miss Wong. But it wasn't the same woman he had met that cold night. She was different now, stronger, more alive. Her hair, once messy, was now tied up in a simple bun. Her clothes were clean, well cared for. She looked more herself. Jackie smiled. She noticed his gaze and moved closer. "I think you tricked me, Chan." Jackie arched her eyebrows. "Oh yeah? What do you mean?" She crossed her arms and looked at the stage. "Ah, you told me it was just a support center." She let out a deep sigh. "You didn't mention that it was also a place where I would find myself." Jackie let out a low laugh. "Some things you only find out on the way." Ms. Wong shook her head, smiling slightly. "I never imagined I'd be working in theater again." Jackie looked at her fondly. "But theater has always been a part of you." She looked at him for a moment, saying nothing. Then a discreet smile appeared on her lips. She turned to the children on stage. Well done, everyone. I want to feel more emotion in these lines." The young voices became louder, and the stage came alive again. Jackie crossed her arms, watching. She was back. Maybe not completely. Perhaps she still had difficult days ahead of her. But for the first time in a long time, she was really there. Life doesn't always give us a second chance, but sometimes all we need is for someone to believe in us. This was the touching reunion between Jackie Chan and his old teacher, a story of overcoming and hope. Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe that a simple act of compassion can transform a life? Leave your opinion in the comments. If this story has touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear this message of hope. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories of empathy, new beginnings, and transformation. Want to continue being moved? Click on one of the videos on the screen and discover another story that will warm your soul. See you in the next video.